All right. Hey, everybody. Welcome to class number 2 of The Lost Road at last. I know that those of you who are watching the recording of this won't notice any delay, but those of you who have faithfully tuned in live deserve some explanation as I'm starting class like 45 minutes late today. Okay, so there was, as you can see, I'm not home. I'm on the road again. And I'm, by the way, hoping by the by that my internet connection here is working fine. I tested it a few times, and I think it should be okay. But anyway, okay, so, but that's the least of my problems, right? So just earlier today, I was giving a talk. I'm in West Virginia this week, and I was giving a talk. I was invited to come, well, my kids are at camp down here, and I was invited to come and give a talk at the local Catholic church, the Church of St. James the Greater. And it was great, wonderful crowd. It was really great people, really fun it's actually the first time I've ever given a talk on Tolkien to a group of Catholics who, it's just sort of brought a whole different perspective to the whole Tolkien conversation that I've ever had. It was really fun. Anyway, it was great, but the problem was it got delayed. Like, I started my talk fully an hour and a half after I had originally planned to be starting my talk. So originally I was like, no problem. I'll be on the road by 8:30, and I'll be back in plenty of time to set up and start class on time. And through a series of mishaps, I didn't even start my talk until 8:30. So imagine the situation, right? Here's me. And I'm thinking, all right, I've got to even have a prayer of starting class within an hour of when it's supposed to start. I'm going to have to do my entire talk and Q&A session within an hour, right? I got to be out the door in an hour, or else it's going to be a complete disaster. So that was a feat compared with which getting through, fully 18 slides is like nothing, right? So anyway, but here I am. And we're all set, and hopefully all should go swimmingly now. Thank you so much for your patience, those of you who waited around. And again, those of you who couldn't wait around but are watching after the fact, I apologize. And this sort of thing, hopefully, will not happen again. So, okay. So let's talk about The Lost Road. That's totally what we should talk about. Hang on a second. I just realized something. In my rush, I forgot to do something. Give me a second here. One last thing I need to do. Okay, right. Sorry. Okay. There we go. All right. Good. Okay. Then I just have to do this. Sorry. It's hard setting up my entire hardware setup, like, completely from scratch. Open, here's my second copy. All right. Good. Okay. See, if I'm going to have any hope of getting through my slides, I got to make sure I have my other copy of my slides. All right. Now, we are so set and ready to go. Okay. So let's talk about The Lost Road. So last time we didn't quite get through the Fall of Numenor. So I do want to go back, and I want to continue the Fall of Numenor tonight. We'll finish that up. I want to take some special time looking at the way the Battle of the Last Alliance is beginning to take shape in Tolkien's mind here at the beginning, and then we'll start talking about the first 4 chapters of The Lost Road. So we had gotten, there are basically essentially 3 versions of the Fall of Numenor that we get, right? The first is that outline sketch, we looked at that, at really a pretty big percentage of the text of that, so that we could see some of the, what are the core concepts when he's first writing down the Numenor idea. What is that story about initially? So we were looking at those 4 sort of primordial concepts of the Numenor story. Then we looked at the first prose version, FN1, Fall of Numenor version 1, and so I want to come back to Fall of Numenor version 2. We won't look at it in as much detail, but I want to touch on a couple things. Of course, one thing that you will have doubtless noticed right away is the familiar face that appears, or at least the familiar name, in the second version of the story. But the high place of its king was at Numenos, in the heart of the land. It was built first by Elrond, son of Earendil. Did you do a double take when you got to that bit? Right? Whom the gods and elves chose to be the lord of that land. For in him the blood of the houses of Hador and Beor was mingled, and with it some part of that of the Eldar and Valar, which he drew from Idril and from Luthien. But Elrond and all his folk were mortal, for the Valar may not withdraw the gift of death, which cometh to men from Ilúvatar. Yet they took on the speech of the elves of the Blessed Realm, as it was and is in Eressëa, and held converse with the elves, and looked afar upon Valinor, for their ships were suffered to sail to Avalon, and their mariners to dwell there for a while. Okay. All right, so Elrond, right? Now we've got the transplantation of Elrond. Elrond, of course, those of you who have been studying the history of Middle-earth with me will remember, Elrond goes back a little bit here, but he's never had a brother yet, right? Elros has not yet appeared. And so one first thing to be noticed, and we noticed it last time, right? Elros does not appear, he is not coeval with Numenor. That is, Numenor is invented prior to Elros. He doesn't come in at the start. So we certainly don't have Elrond and Elros kind of springing into the story together and having different fates, right? That's not where the story begins. Nor even after we get the story of Numenor do we get Elros right away. But we do see that impulse of his to bring it into Elrond's family, right? Why? It makes sense. We see here the explanation. We didn't get Elrond before. We just got these random kings of Numenor, later on down the road, but we didn't get Elrond. His choice to bring in Elrond makes sense, right? And you can see the rationale that he brings forward. The two primary houses of the Edain are brought together in Elrond's lineage, as well as the Eldar and the Valar, right? So we get Idril, we get Luthien, we get Thingol, we get everybody. So the the entirety of the resistance against Melkor gets basically kind of sort of crystallized into Elrond, right? Elrond is the sort of the heir in this sense of like the entire First Age, right? Elrond is the whole First Age, kind of brought together into one place. So it makes sense, but again, I don't want to take this for granted, right? Notice how this changes the whole tenor of the island of Numenor from the beginning, right? And remember, as we were talking about it last time, and I was talking about how the whole Numenor story, far from being like the natural next chapter, or sort of, the tuning next time to find out what happens next kind of deal at the end of the story of the Elder Days that we got in the earlier Silmarillion stuff, it was instead like an unexpected sequel, right? Where he had to go back and rewrite the ending in order to tack on the business about Numenor. And that's what we got more clearly in the first version of The Fall of Numenor. Now in the second version, this seems to be an impulse, or at least the effect of his inclusion of Elrond here, is to make the island of Numenor and the story of the people of Numenor the more sort of natural successor of the story of the Elder Days, right? Because again, all of the whole story of all the previous material is all kind of encapsulated in Elrond, and he is placed as the king of Numenor and that sort of central figurehead at the beginning of their story. Kate Neville says it seems like this was while the Hobbit Elrond was not Eärendil's son. Yeah, Kate says, it's complicated, right? Elrond predates the Hobbit. He is including already, as he recalled in one of those later letters that he wrote about this, when he named that dude in the Hobbit Elrond, that half-elven character. We'd already seen Elrond in the Silmarillion material in the Quenta, which was written at least at about the same time. So Elrond himself kind of predates that stuff, and yet the Hobbit Elrond, as I've talked about in other contexts, doesn't really fit perfectly with that Elrond. So it's not just the same Elrond. It's not just the same story. So Kate, it is really to me interesting too to see this. There are some similarities between how Elrond is being described here and how Elrond is described in The Hobbit. But it's quite different. It's obviously much more intimately connected with those with those earlier stories. Exactly, Sharon. Yeah, The Hobbit was kind of a parallel universe for a while. Exactly, that certainly is how it looks, how it seems to function. Okay, so, but again, to me, the thing that is most, I mean, we can see the anticipation of Elros, like we know how this story is going to come out, right? And we know that Elrond himself is going to get shipped back to Middle-earth. However, again, to me, the bigger picture here is that more intimate connection. Not that he's, reconciling it with the mythology, but again, he's making the story of Numenor not just, and now time for a different story about humans, right? Or, meanwhile, in the island of the humans, here's what they started to get up to, right? Instead, it is very much, this is the next chapter of the people of Middle-earth who were resisting Melkor, right? Here's what happened in that world, in that domain afterwards. So I think that that's pretty interesting. Okay. Another thing that I think is really interesting about the second version of The Fall of Numenor is that there's a bit of a shift in the emphasis on the moral shortcomings of the Numenoreans. And it came to pass that Sauron, servant of Morgoth, grew mighty in Middle-earth, and the mariners of Numenor brought rumor of him. Some said that he was a king greater than the king of Numenor. Some said that he was one of the gods or their sons, set to govern Middle-earth. A few reported that he was an evil spirit. Perchance Morgoth himself returned. But this was held to be only a foolish fable of the wild men. Tarkalion was king of Numenor in those days, and he was proud. And believing that the gods had delivered the dominion of earth to the Numenoreans, he would not brook a king mightier than himself in any land. Therefore he purposed to send his servants to summon Sauron to Numenor, to do homage before him. The Lord sent messages to the king, and spake through the mouths of wise men, and counselled him against this mission, for they said that Sauron would work evil if he came, but he could not come to Numenor, unless he was summoned and guided by the king's messengers. But Tarkalion, in his pride, put aside the counsel, and he sent many ships. Okay, so of course in my subtitle here I've emphasized what I think, what sort of seems to me to be the sort of the chief new kind of moral element here, right? The increased emphasis on the pride of the Numenoreans. Now, you might think, well, dude, like how much more proud could they get, right? We're talking about the people who were already in the earlier versions of this story going to attack the island of the gods, right? So, the Undying Lands and the Mountain of the Gods. So, I mean, that's already pretty arrogant, right? I mean, how high is my threshold for increase of pride? But the thing that I wanted to focus on, though, the thing that really jumped at me, yes, of course, their downfall, in their downfall, it is their, sort of staggering arrogance that leads to their downfall. But the change in this story is that their pride is itself what opens them to Sauron in the first place. Remember, in the earlier version, they are simply deceived by Sauron. He comes among them in power. There's that early story about the wave, bringing the ship onto land, and him arising and appearing, standing on the rock, and prophesying to them of the return of Morgoth, which I'm sure was like pretty impressive, right? There's the other one where he comes in the form of a bird. So again, in both cases, we get Sauron coming in with signs and wonders and misleading everybody. But the Numenoreans, although they're already declining in a sense, they're already, they have the desire for the Undying Land, and they're longing, kind of getting out of control, and they're already embalming people and that kind of thing. So like their death issues are already still going, but they're not so fallen anymore. Like they are not opened up to Sauron because of sort of a moral choice that they make or that their king makes. This, I think, is a pretty significant change. The idea that Sauron would never even have been able to have access to them had they not themselves initiated a rivalry with him, right? And why do they do it? So the arrogance, the initial arrogance, the pre-arrogance, right, of the Numenoreans, not only just to bring Sauron to the island and force him to humble himself before them. I mean, it's already pretty bad, right? But merely the motivation of saying like, oh, I've heard rumors that Sauron is pretty awesome, that he's more awesome than us. We're not going to take that sitting down, right? We're going to go and put him in his place. This already shows us that the Numenoreans are in a more advanced state of moral decline at this point, and emphasized, of course, by the fact that the king is counseled through the mouths of wise men that this is dumb, right? Don't bring Sauron here. He's only going to cause trouble, and he's dangerous and he's powerful, and he cannot come here if we don't invite him. It's like Dracula, right? Anyway, this is so you've got the rivalry at first, and then the defiance of that order, right? The defiance of that advice, and we're going to bring him here anyway. It shows that he is. They're further along, as I say, and it in my mind really shifts the emphasis of the Numenoreans much more firmly towards pride. That pride becomes the thing which is their chief characteristic, essentially from the beginning here, at the beginning of their wrongdoing. In any case, much more so than we saw in the earlier versions. Yeah, Thomas, exactly. Thomas Kaluza says, it's like Denethor being prideful enough to think he can wholly control what his Palantir sees. Yeah, exactly. Thomas, remember, Denethor teaches us the correlation between pride and despair, right? And although Denethor, rejects that connection, it's nevertheless illustrated to us pretty clearly. And I think we can see that with the Numenoreans as well, right? They too despair. It's in a sense their despair. Their despair of life, right? Their inability to prolong their lives, their being prevented from going to the Undying Lands, that leads them to so we get the pride and despair involved in the step that they finally take there too. Yes, Yana, you're absolutely right that moral decline is inversely correlated to military prowess and industrialization. That's not like a natural law in Tolkien's world or anything. I mean, you couldn't say that, all morally good cultures are militarily weak cultures. I mean, there's not a purely inverse relationship, but Yana, you're absolutely right that there's a correlation. I think Yana, that exactly where the correlation would fall is not to military might abstractly understood or sort of, some kind of absolute value of military strength. It's increase, right? A society that is becoming more powerful militarily is rarely, in Tolkien, a society which is becoming better, right? Morally improved. Good. Yeah, Arthur points out that Sauron standing there and prophesying reminds him of Mandos, delivering the doom of Mandos from the rock. Yeah, I agree. It is reminiscent of that. That's certainly the kind of posture that he's striking, right? Good. Excellent. Yeah, Josiah says that he'd say the problem lies in military specialization rather than might, see Tolkien and Orome. Exactly. It's not that strength, even military strength, even, it's not like fighting ability is a bad thing, intrinsically. Absolutely. Right? Clearly not. I would even say, Josiah, that sort of the correlation between military strength and like technology, like the more a society is focusing its efforts, right, its sub-creative efforts on on military developments, essentially, the more that happens, the worse of a sign it is, clearly. Arthur and Yana are both mentioning the sort of the Sauron standing up on the rock and preaching, and how that sort of puts him in a Sermon on the Mount, like Jesus standing on the hill and addressing people kind of position. Or Moses on the mountaintop, right, coming down to the people with the commandments. I think both of those kind of sorry, both of those authoritative, teacherly, as well as prophetic roles I think that's very much the atmosphere that Tolkien was invoking there around Sauron. And yeah, Carson, you're absolutely right to be thinking about Faramir's quote about about not loving the warrior for his strength or the arrow for its swiftness. Yeah, exactly. Precisely the kind of direction I think we should be thinking of. Okay, let's turn to the Last Alliance, because I want to get to the Lost Road. So Last Alliance. So first, I want to start off with a little recap, right? I want to, because in order to compare, I want to look more closely at this. So just, we won't talk about this much, but just to remind you, here's the first version. This is in the outline. The longing of the Numenorians, their longing for life on Earth, their ship burials and their great tombs, some evil and some good. Many of the good sit upon the west shore. These also seek out the fading elves. How, struck out at time of writing, Agildor changed to Amroth, wrestled with Thu, and drove him to the center of the earth and the iron forest. Okay, so again, this is that first outline, right? And all of this paragraph that I've given here is a description of the Numenoreans in Middle-earth after the downfall, right? So we don't get this sort of new chapter being written, led by the faithful, right? That we're going to get later on. We just have the people of Numenor, and some of them survived, and the culture of the Numenoreans that survived doesn't seem significantly different, right? We've still got the tombs and the longing for life on Earth. Some are evil and some are good, right? And again, as I said at the time, the emphasis there seems to be, oh, and by the way, they're not all evil, right? I mean, that seems to be kind of the default after the downfall. But we do get this. Some of them are good. Some of them seek out the elves. Oh, and hey, there's this one story, right? Amroth wrestled Thu and drove him to the center of the earth. Isn't that fun, right? Okay, so then that gets fleshed out in the first prose version. And it is said that Amroth was king of Beleriand, and he took counsel with Elrond, son of Eärendil, and with such of the elves as remained in the west. And they passed the mountains, and came into inner lands far from the sea, and they assailed the fortress of Thu. And Amroth wrestled with Thu, and was slain. But Thu was brought to his knees, and his servants were dispelled, and the peoples of Beleriand destroyed his dwellings, and drove him forth. And he fled to a dark forest, and hid himself. Okay. Yeah, no, Arthur, sadly, he wasn't quite thoroughly defeated. Exactly. Anyway, so, okay. So a couple things here to notice, kind of as we drive by this passage. First, the King of Beleriand business. Notice how that goes along with, or anticipates really, because this is version 1, the first full version, the Elrond shift, right? That is to say, once again, we see this impulse as Tolkien is beginning this sequel to make the explicit connection backwards to the earlier material, even to the extent of rewriting a significant element of the end of the previous stories in order to accommodate the sequel, right? And in this case, it's the drowning of Beleriand. So we're told pretty clearly in the Quenta that Beleriand was taken out, right? In the War of Wrath, Beleriand drowns and it's gone. He's brought it back, right? Beleriand is still there. This is still a story of Beleriand. So we can see now the struggle between Amroth and Thu, which he pointed to, which he anticipated in the outline, is now being placed explicitly into the context of, it's now the next chapter of the struggle of the remnant of all the good guys of Beleriand against the forces of darkness, right? Against the shadow. In this case being Thu, the chief servant of Morgoth and his chief surviving representative here on Middle-earth, right? And now the peoples of Beleriand are destroyed, right? Well, anyway, Amroth is killed, sorry. The peoples of Beleriand destroyed his dwellings and drove him forth. So they win, although Amroth himself is destroyed, right? So we get the tragedy, but we get the success. Did I talk about the word dispelled? I think I probably did, right? We can see, remember, Sauron, ring wraiths, that's still a ways down the road, right? We're not there yet. but we can see the anticipation of it. Those of you who remember Thu from the Lays of Beleriand, from the Lay of Leithian, will recall that he was the necromancer. He was the master of these spirits of the dead, and of the spirits, the evil spirits that he invested in wolves to make him the Lord of Werewolves as well. So the idea of his servants being not killed, not driven away, but dispelled, we can see that one word seems to me a really interesting kind of bridge between the old Thu, master of evil spirits, and the new Thu, right? Sauron, the Lord of who is still the Lord of shades and spirits, though they're wraiths in this case. Yeah, good. Yeah, good. That's Arthur is quoting Tom Hillman, who is too shy to say it himself. What Balrog's to the left of me, Nazgul on the right. Here I am, stuck in the middle with Thu. Yeah, exactly, Tom. That sounds like Tom Hillman all over. Anyway, Josiah points out that the bit about wrestling, the use of the verb wrestling with Thu, seems to echo all the way back to, we seem to get references to that or echoes of that in the Sauron's hand being black and yet burned like fire, and so Gil-galad was destroyed in the little memoir that Isildur writes about the battle. Right, we do get this indication, right? This hint of an actual grappling match between Sauron and the good guys, right? So it does seem that image of an actual hand-to-hand combat, not even weapon to weapon, but hand to hand, is still lingering in Tolkien's mind when we get to the Lord of the Rings. Okay. Take 3. So here we are back now to the Fall of Numenor version 2 and the third trek through the Last Alliance. And it is said that in Beleriand there arose a king who was of Numenorean race, and he was named Elendil, that is, elf friend. Notice already, still in Beleriand, right? So that linkage back to the earlier material is still very central. Now the name has changed, right? Instead of Amroth, we once again toss aside Amroth, the name Tolkien loves, and we'll keep coming back to, and we get Elendil now. Elendil, which his name is significant because, as is instantly translated, it means elf friend. So notice how the alliance between humans and elves is being made much more central, right? It's been a feature since the early outlines, right? Some of the descendants of Numenor hung out with the elves, right? And one in particular allied himself with them. But it's now become a part of the very identity of so he's not just like some human king who, by the way, also hung out with elves. No, it's part of who he is. It's his name, right? His name is Elf Friend. So that is becoming a more and more central part now of the story. And he took counsel with the elves that remained in Middle-earth, and these abode then mostly in Beleriand. And he made a league with Gil-galad, the elf king, who was descended from Feanor. And their armies were joined, and passed the mountains, and came into the inner lands far from the sea. And they came at last even to Mordor, the Black Country, where Sauron, that is in the Gnomish tongue named Thu, came forth in person, and Elendil and Gil-galad wrestled with him, and both were slain. But Thu was thrown down, and his bodily shape destroyed, and his servants were dispelled, and the host of Beleriand destroyed his dwelling. But Thu's spirit fled far away, and was hidden in waste places, and took no shape again for many ages. But it is sung sadly by the elves that the war with Thu hastened the fading of the Eldar, decreed by the gods. For Thu had power beyond their measure, as Felagund, king of Nargothrond, had found aforetime, and the elves expended their strength and their substance in the assault upon him. And this was the last of the services of the firstborn to men, and it is held the last of the deeds of alliance, before the fading of the elves and the estrangement of the two kindreds. And here endeth the tale of the ancient world, as it is known to the elves. Okay. As always, whenever I read, especially a long passage like this, always really interested to hear your own observations, right? I've got some observations that I want to make, but I'd love to hear what jumps out at you, right? So please do feel free, even while I'm reading, to begin typing some of your own observations as I go through. Okay, so I talked about the name of Elendil and the significance there. Notice how this is, again, Gil-galad, the Elf King who is descended from Fëanor. Once again, we get the Beleriandic pedigree, right? We're right back to the Quenta. This is clearly a continuation, sort of the next chapter of that story. This is of course the birth of Mordor. As Christopher Tolkien says, this is certainly the first time the name Mordor is ever used. So that's fun. Marie, Gil-galad is a descendant of Fëanor here, exactly. So that is fun, though that's going to change. Gil-galad's family tree changes a lot, actually. So you notice what else is different here? The elf also dies, right? Elendil and Gil-galad, just as the alliance is a more central part of the story and that it's reflected in Elendil's own name, this is now no longer the story of the heroic Numenorean descended king who rose up and wrestled with Sauron and died but drove him away. That was the story before. That's not the story now, right? Now it's the story of how the Elven king and Elendil together both wrestled with him and both were killed, right? So it's more egalitarian. Marie would like to ask Gil-galad, who's your daddy? Indeed, that's a question Tolkien had a hard time answering for a long time. More. What else do we see? What else do we notice? Of course, but it is sung sadly that the war with Thu hastened the fading of the Eldar. Right. This is not just the last time that the elves and the humans are going to be allied with each other. It's something that actually hastens the fading of the elves. And once again, we see how this story, because this is the last episode of the sequel, right, of the first age, and we see how Tolkien is bringing the end of that story around to the same place that the story originally ended, namely the fading of the elves and the dominion of men. And so to me it's very interesting that we come back to the same place and we see again a new explanation for why the elves are fading, right? Or at least why they're fading so fast and why the dominion of men comes on in the way that it does. But also the fact that this happens as a consequence not of sort of rebelling against the Valar and going to Middle-earth, which is one of the things that we see. I mean, for those of you who didn't read it with us, one version of the story of the fading of the elves originally was that the elves who came to the War of Wrath, the elves who came to fight against Melkor and rescue the Noldor and the rest of them, the Sindar and the rest of them that were there, so that the force which comes and saves the day at the end was a rebellious force. Like the Valar told them not to go, and they went in defiance of the Valar and got in trouble for it, and weren't allowed back home. So that was one version of the story as we got it in previous versions. So you can see how the story of the Last Alliance puts a very different spin on the fading of the elves. At the end, it's still tragic, right? Still sad. It's still sung sadly. We still miss the elves when they fade and are gone, but they go out a little differently, right? In both cases, they were going out in a blaze of glory, right? They were going out doing a good thing, even a self-sacrificial thing. But now it's done in alliance with humans, in that much more kind of equal alliance. Not just saving their own kindred and also the men who happen to be allied with them, but really coming in and helping to establish so that the dominion of men is not only comes about because the elves fade, but the elves fade because they are sacrificing themselves in order to bring about a peaceful dominion of men, right? Not under the power of Sauron. So that's pretty fascinating, right? That's a really interesting sort of take on the story of the fading of the elves, which is quite different than we got before. But wait, there's more, right? The second version of the fall of Numenor is the last version that we get of this before he comes back and revises it and turns it into the Akalabaith. But he redoes the Last Alliance, right? He doesn't retell the whole story, but he does retell the Last Alliance story. So here's the fourth version of the Last Alliance. But there remains a legend of Beleriand. Now that land had been broken in the great battle with Morgoth, and at the fall of Numenor and the change of the fashion of the world, it perished. For the sea covered all that was left, save some of the mountains that remained as islands, even up to the feet of Eredlindon. But that land where Luthien had dwelt remained, and was called Lindon. A gulf of the sea came through it, and a gap was made in the mountains, through which the river Lune flowed out. But the land that was left north and south of the gulf, the elves... but in the land that was north and south of the gulf, the elves remained, and Gil-galad, son of Felagund, son of Finrod, was their king. And they made havens in the Gulf of Lune, whence any of their people, or any of the other elves, or any other of the elves that fled the darkness and sorrow of Middle-earth, could sail into the true west and return no more. In Lindon, Sauron had as yet no dominion. Okay. See, this is only half of it. I've got another slide in which we do the other half of this new text. But notice what's interesting. What's missing from this opening of the Last Alliance? Anybody notice a distinct lack of something? Right? Remember, this is the last chapter. This is the last segment of the Fall of Numenor. What's missing from this? Men, Michael, exactly. Any reference to Numenor whatsoever, right? This is an elf story, right? In this version, this is contextualized entirely as an elf story. So we're no longer just creating a link between the later Numenor story and the elf stories of the earlier ages, right? No. This is explicitly and he's tying it more distinctly. Not just like by saying things like this is the land where Luthien had dwelt and all that kind of thing, right? But he's returning back. He's undoing the revision that he had made in order to accommodate the sequel, right? No, actually, Beleriand still drowned, right? He goes back to that and tells this whole entirely elf-centered focus. And notice in Lindon, Sauron had as yet no dominion, right? So Gil-galad, they told Sauron to talk to the hand, right? They were having none of it. So we have this solidarity of the elves. We have this strength of the elves to resist Sauron. He has no power over them, right? That's the context in which the story begins. But wait, there's more. And it is said that the brethren Elendil and Valandil, escaping from the fall of Numenor, came at last to the mouths of the rivers that flowed into the western sea. And Elendil, that is, elf friend, who had aforetime loved the folk of Erisea, came to Lindon and dwelt there a while, and passed into Middle-earth, and established a realm in the north. But Valandil sailed up the great river Anduin, and established another realm far in the south. But Sauron dwelt in Mordor, the Black Country, and that was not very distant from Ondor, the realm of Valandil. And Sauron made war against all elves and all men of Westerness, or others that aided them, and Valandil was hard pressed. Therefore Elendil and Gil-galad, seeing that unless some stand were made, Sauron would become lord of all Middle-earth, they took counsel together, and they made a great league. And Gil-galad and Elendil marched into Middle-earth, and gathered force of men and elves, and they assembled at Imladrist. Okay. What do you notice? Marie notices that now Gil-galad is Finrod Felagund's son. Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Gil-galad is going to wander around the elvish genealogies pretty much for Tolkien's entire life. A lot of people don't realize how much of a trick question is who is Gil-galad's dad? Right? It's way more of a trick question than it might seem at first. Anyway, okay. So Michael asks a great question. Is Lindon not Middle-earth? Yeah, it is. It is. Beleriand was Middle-earth too, right? It was part of the Great Lands. I mean, there was Valinor and then there was Middle-earth. So it's always been Middle-earth, but it's a land apart, right? because and Michael, that's exactly what I think is one of the chief emphases there in the first half of this account, right? Or at least the first half of as much of this account as we get. It's obviously not done when he cuts it off here, but anyway, it's a part of Middle-earth, Michael, but it's obviously set apart, right? It is the place where Gil-galad lives. It is the place essentially where the Elder Days are still going on, right? It is established explicitly as the link back to the Undying Land, right? It's the place. How does he say it? Let me make sure I get this right. Whence any of their people or any of the elves that fled from the darkness and sorrow of Middle-earth could sail into the true west and return no more, right? The straight road that still exists, right? That is operating on this plane above the rounded world, right? That departs from Lindon, right? Lindon is in this way literally still in contact with the Elder Days, with the old world. So, okay, having established that as this very different thing, now we have the Numenorean kingdoms finally come in, and what happens? We get the brothers, Elendil and Valandil, right? So we get the establishment of the two kingdoms, right? So they come from Numenor, and we can tell who they are, right? Their names are very significant. We saw the significance of Elendil's name in the previous one, right? We know the significance of Valandil's name as it becomes a major part of the Lost Road, right? So you've got like the elf friend and the friend of the Valar, and they are brothers, and they come to Middle-earth and establish these two kingdoms. Notice how far away we are from the early outline where like the remnants of Numenor are still they're still Numenoring, right? They're in Middle-earth. They're still doing their Numenor thing. But then one arises from among them who does this extraordinary thing. But, they were all kind of mostly bad. But some of them were good. It was okay. Here we get now a different story where the two brethren who survive Numenor, Elendil and Valandil, elf friend and Valar friend, god friend, they are the two who arrive in Middle-earth and establish kingdoms. So now the Numenorean kingdoms in exile are distinctly elf-friendly, Valar-friendly. This is not the survival of Numenor. This is not Numenor continuing into Middle-earth as we got before. This is a revival, right? This is a renewal. This is setting back the clock on Numenor. That now these descendants of Numenor who have not fallen away, who have not given into that pride and attacked the Valar, they are establishing kingdoms, and they're working with the elves. Of course, right? Of course Elendil joins with Gil-galad, right? His name is Elfriend, for crying out loud, right? What else would he do? And yeah, James, it is interesting that in the realm in the north occurs especially because of Elendil's friendship with the elves. Exactly. He lives there because Gil-galad is nearby, right? He hangs out near Gil-galad. Also, I will say so two things. First, in the notes as Christopher Tolkien explains them, this version of this version of The Last Alliance is late. I mean, he came back to redo this later on. The reference to Ondor shows that he's already doing The Lord of the Rings. As Christopher Tolkien says, it's very clear that the realm of Gondor, which was originally called Ondor, is an invention from the Lord of the Rings process, and we'll look at that if we end up going on to do the Return of the Shadow next. So the fact that Ondor is mentioned by name suggests that these paragraphs are being written after he's already working on the Lord of the Rings. But you'll notice that means while he's already working on the Lord of the Rings, we don't have Isildur yet, right? We don't have Isildur and Inarion. We don't have Elendil and his sons. We have Elendil and his brother, Valandil. And in a sense, that seems to me to make a little bit more sense, right? It's one of the things that to me is really fun about reading the history of Middle-earth is there's so many times that we come across things, and I'll just kind of remember back to when I was, first reading these and thinking about these, when I was a teenager. And I'll have these moments where I'm like, oh, I always wondered about that, right? But I've long since, I've long since familiarized myself with it enough that, it doesn't strike me as strange anymore. But I can remember originally finding it strange. We're told in the Lord of the Rings that Elendil's ships and Isildur and Anarian's ships are separated in the Great Storm. Nothing strange about that, right? And so Elendil washes up in the north, and Isildur and Anarian eventually come into port down in the south. Nothing strange about them being separated. But it always struck me as a little bit odd of them establishing different and parallel kingdoms, right? I mean, if they were separated like this, why didn't they, sort it out, right? They had the Palantiri, right? So why didn't they, why didn't Isildur make a, I almost said pick up the phone. Why didn't he pick up the phone? Why didn't he pick up the Palantir, right? And make a call, right? Hey, Dad, what's up? Where are you guys, right? Oh, way up in the north? Yeah, we're down here in the south. Yeah, Sauron lives like right across the street. It's kind of inconvenient. Can we come up and join you, right? I thought maybe, I don't know, maybe we'd make one unified kingdom instead of like two totally separate kingdoms separated by hundreds of leagues of empty land, right? I mean, that was always, I remember having that thought earlier on before, it began to seem to me totally inescapable that that's obviously how it would happen. This version of the story helps to me. That kind of makes a little bit more sense of two brothers to be establishing two kingdoms, not for them to be, in a way in which it never seemed to me totally intuitive. Why Elendil's sons didn't just come up and join his kingdom instead. Anyway, okay. Now, as we know, Valandil is going to have a different role, and he's going to be replaced, and his name is going to be displaced. But of course, this connection between Elendil and Valandil, that is not between those two brothers in this story, but those two concepts, Elendil and Valandil, are going to be obviously very important as we go into the Lost Road. We can kind of guess where the story is. We don't get anything past them assembling at Imladrist, which has a T for some reason. Obviously we can guess where we're headed, right? Probably Elendil and Gil-galad are still gonna bite it. But then what? What's gonna happen to Valandil, right? What's gonna be his role? Was he going to do the Isildur thing? Was that what's going to happen? Was he going to cut the, ring from Sauron's hand? Was he going to be the survivor who was going to establish the kingdom? In which case, which kingdom was it going to be? Were they all three of them going to die? The casualty count had been increasing, right? It was originally just Amroth. Then it became Elendil and Gil-galad, right? Was it going to be Elendil and Gil-galad and Valandil in this version? I wonder. I don't really know. Yana, you're right. There's no mention of any ring yet, so we're not there. But again, I'm thinking of Valandil in that Isildur role, right, of being the one who survives, the one who sort of triumphs and lives of the three of them. So we don't know where this is going, but this is as far as we get in the Fall of Numenor. Time to shift to the Lost Road. So one thing I want to acknowledge at the beginning as we start talking about the Lost Road is that it's hard to escape the intensely autobiographical element of this story, right? Those of you who have been, listening to me and taking classes from me for a while know that I don't like talking about Tolkien's life. I don't like the kind of... I share Tolkien's distaste at the kind of interpretation that always wants to either draw conclusions about Tolkien's life based on the stories that he writes, or conversely draw conclusions about Tolkien's stories because of what we know about his life. And both of those things seem to me very much oversimplified and very much as likely to be right as wrong, or as likely to be misleading as helpful. So usually I don't go there at all. But you can't escape it in The Lost Road. There are two stories that Tolkien wrote where the autobiographical element, you just can't escape. You can't run from it. it's really prominent, and Marie was just talking about it. It's this and Leaf by Niggle. But Marie, I would say this more than Leaf by Niggle. I mean, this 10 times as much as Leaf by Niggle. Niggle is obviously related to Tolkien himself and sort of embodies many of Tolkien's own attitudes and things. But at least Niggle isn't exactly the same. I mean, Niggle is at least a painter, right? We at least have a kind of a parallel instead of an exact. But Alboin, I mean, the career that he has and his academic focus and everything, it's almost exactly right. So I just wanted to draw some attention, and I'm doing this. I don't want to take things for granted. I know many of you know these things, and I don't want you guys to think that I'm oversimplifying. But I do want to make sure people, because I don't want to assume that everybody knows all this stuff already. There are many of the things that are kind of put into Alboin's mouth here, which are Tolkien's own opinions and theories and ideas, right? And we see him expressing them through Alboin. One major example here. And Brianna, you're right. Tolkien was a painter. Not quite like Niggle, but anyway, yeah, no, you're right. You're right, Brianna. You're right. Anyway, okay. Example. But Alboin liked the flavor of the older northern languages, quite as much as he liked some of the things written in them. He got to know a bit about linguistic history, of course. He found that you rather had it thrust on you, anyway, by the grammar writers of unclassical languages. Footnote. I don't think that everyone who's ever studied northern languages felt that linguistic history was thrust upon them in the same way that Tolkien kind of took to it. Anyway, but whatever. Not that he objected. Excuse me, Alboin. Did I say Tolkien? I meant Alboin. Not that he objected. Sound changes were a hobby of his at the age when other boys were learning about the insides of motor cars. But although he had some idea of what were supposed to be the relationships of European languages, it did not seem to him quite all the story. The languages he liked had a definite flavor, and to some extent a similar flavor, which they shared. It seemed, too, in some way related to the atmosphere of the legends and myths told in the languages. So yeah, Mary, exactly. This is the way that he, not just what he says about language, but the way he talks about it. The word flavor, right? That was a word that Tolkien used when he was just trying to explain how he felt about, why did he like northern languages so much? Why did he spend so much time with Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse and Welsh and things like that? Why did he like those? Why did he drop Latin and Greek in favor of philology and Germanic philology especially? Yeah. Carita says, the older northern languages tastes like sorrow and heroic defeat. Yeah, it sure does. So anyway, I mean, this is not only exactly a kind of thing that Tolkien could have said, this is exactly a thing that Tolkien did say about himself. And again, it's not just a parallel, this is exactly Tolkien's own opinion. So again, you cannot make an argument that Alboin is not expressing, Tolkien's own opinions, that Alboin is not connected to Tolkien autobiographically, which then is an interesting stepping off point. So, okay, considering that he put so many of his own opinions and his own experiences and his own points of view growing up and all that stuff into Alboin's mind and mouth, does that mean then that the other things that Alboin does and says are also like Tolkien's own experience? That is, where does I am trying to articulate my own experience stop, and when does I am writing a fantasy story about time travel begin, right? And that line in The Lost Road is, to me, a really fascinating kind of question. Take, for instance, this passage. This is when his father his father Oswin has just asked him about his elf Latin, right? How is your Arisaean coming on? Oh, I haven't done anything of that sort for a long while. At least, hardly anything, said Alboin. It isn't getting on too well, then? Not lately. Too much else to do, I suppose. But I got a lot of jolly new words a few days ago. I am sure Lomelinde means nightingale, for instance. And certainly Lome is night, though not darkness. The verb is very sketchy still, but he hesitated. Reticence and uneasy conscience were at war with his habit of what he called partnership with the pater, and his desire to unbosom the secret anyway. But the real difficulty is that another language is coming through as well. It seems to be related, but quite different, much more northern. Alda was a tree, a word I got a long time ago. In the new language, it is Galav and Orn. The sun and moon seem to have similar names in both, Anar and Isil, beside Anor and Ithil. I like the first one, then the other, in different moods. Beleriandic is really very attractive, but it complicates things. So what do we see here? What exactly are we getting from Tolkien here? So, okay, because we have two things going on at once. Or do we? Right? On the one hand, we have Alboin as voicing many of Tolkien's own quite private thoughts about language. Remember, this is early, right? We're talking 1936, 1937, he's writing this. So this is not Tolkien looking back on this from years later, right? Not from like the time he was writing A Secret Vice. This is Tolkien very early on, sort of secretly putting some of his, before anyone would recognize it, right? Now, after the fact, having read all the other stuff that Tolkien wrote, we can recognize this, right? We come to him like, oh yeah, that's Tolkien himself, right? But if Alboin and Oswin had accepted The Lost Road for publication, and these chapters, remember, as Christopher says, were sent he sent these out for publication. He didn't just write these, right? Had Alboin and Oswin accepted The Lost Road for publication, which they didn't, who would have gotten it, right? No one would have gotten it. Almost nobody would have gotten it. Would have understood that this was Tolkien speaking wholly autobiographically. It just would have seemed like a kind of an idiosyncratic kind of fiction, right? But anyway, okay, so the one thing we have is Tolkien articulating his own experience with language. And on the other hand, we have this fiction story, this fantasy story of Alboin and time travel. He describes the words as coming through, right? I love the shift within the context of this passage, right? How at the beginning his father asks him, how's your elf Latin coming, right? And he asks when he asks it, the implication is that he's assuming that his son is making it up, right? Oh yeah, you were inventing a language, right? How's your made up language coming? And at first, Alboin responds on the same level, right? I haven't done anything of that sort for a long while. Oh yeah, that pastime I used to have of making up languages, haven't made anything up lately, right? Again, at first. And his father's response, it isn't getting on too well then, is in the same mode, right? Getting on, like, have you completed that project that you set yourself to, right? That project of making up the languages. But that's not how he goes on to talk about it. I got a lot of jolly new words a few days ago. Not I made them up, not I thought of, right? I got them. I received them. And then the way he goes on talking about it, I'm sure that this is what this means. Not, I think I'm going to make Lomelinde mean nightingale. And then like Lome could mean night, but not darkness. Wouldn't that be cool? Right? He doesn't sound like somebody who's inventing. He talks like someone who's discovering. I think Lomelinde means nightingale. And then he talks about this other language, right? So, yeah, awkward thing. There's this other language coming through. Notice that phrase. Another language is coming through. Like there's a wall, a permeable wall between him and where the languages come from, right? And they're slipping through cracks in that wall or something. And he's picking them up. But he's definitely not inventing, right? This is not a creative project in that sense. Is this setting up the fantasy story of time travel? It absolutely is. But at the same time, this is very like how Tolkien himself... So does that mean we're not talking about autobiography anymore, right? No, this is in fact how Tolkien talks about language and even about language invention. It's very much like exactly... Who was it who just said that? Yana. Exactly, Yana. Just like in Leaf by Nigel. It's exactly the way that Nigel talks about the leaves in his painting, right? He's not making them up. He is trying to capture them, right? He has this, he's gotten a glimpse of them, and he's trying to transmit the glimpse through his painting. But it's not about him. They're not coming out of his head. They really exist, right? Out there, somewhere, in some sense. Marie, exactly. He does often talk as if he's finding things out. He's discovering things rather than making stuff up. So again, especially given how directly autobiographical that previous passage was, you can't help but ask, at least I can't help but ask, is this how it was? When Tolkien was inventing his elf languages, is this what it was like? Is this him again through the veil of this fiction, just simply giving voice to his own experience? Would he have said, would the 20-year-old Tolkien have said, if you had asked him at the time, how is it, aren't you making up languages? How is that going? Would he have said things like, I got a lot of jolly new words a few days ago, right? This new language is coming through, and I'm trying to figure out its relation. I think I can see its relationship to Arisayan, right? Is that the way that he would have talked? I kind of suspect that he might have. Again, it's like how he talked throughout his life. So I'm not yet convinced that we've shifted away from autobiography and into fantasy yet, right? Now, of course, several of you are pointing out obviously differences. It's not like it's like it's actual, literally autobiographical, like this totally happened to me, right? Especially, obviously, as I'm sure most of you know, Tolkien's father died when Tolkien was, 2? He was very, very young. Alboin grows up without his mother. Alboin's mother dies in childbirth. Tolkien grew up with his mom until she died. He was still young. He was orphaned when he was still young. But he did grow up and was raised and taught by his mom for many years alone. Because his dad died not quite at his birth, but as far as he was, as far as his own memories are concerned, pretty close to it. So again, it's not like it's exactly autobiographical in events, but it's about Alboin's experience and his perceptions that really strike me. Okay, more. Let's keep going on. It depends how far you went back, said the elder Errol. If you went back beyond the Ice Ages, I imagine you would find nothing in these parts, or at any rate a pretty beastly and uncomely race, and a tooth-and-nail culture, and a disgusting language with no echoes for you, unless those of food noises. Would you? Said Alboin. I wonder. Anyway, you can't go back, said his father, except within the limits prescribed to us mortals. You can go back in a sense by study, long and patient work. You had better go in for archaeology as well as philology. They ought to go well enough together, though they aren't joined very often. Good idea, said Alboin. But you remember long ago, you said I was not all bone. Well, I want some mythology as well. I want myths, not only bones and stones. These are the three things that Alboin connects together, right? To really get in touch with the past, you need to have bones, stones, and flesh, right? The bones are the language, the stones are the archaeology, and the meat is myth, right? Story, mythology. That's okay. That's really cool. Um, Notice the disjunction right here. Would you? I wonder. Right. Um, yeah, he's not at all sure. Right. He's not at all convinced. Notice that his father is articulating essentially the modern myth of progress. Right. The modern myth of progress says the further back you go, the more brutish and simplistic human language, culture, and you know, physical as well as you know, material culture as well as social culture would get. Right, the further back you go, the more crude everything gets. So yeah, tooth and nail culture, disgusting language, and an uncomely race. I wonder, says Alboin. Alboin is clearly not convinced. He sort of thinks that if you go back, you might find something together. And yeah, Thomas, exactly. The link between philology and mythology in the context of his career, yeah, again, we're still an autobiography, right? And again, even this, again, are we talking about the fantasy story of time travel? Yes, we're clearly setting that up, right? Alboin's desire to go back, his father saying you can't go back, him wondering what you would really find if you did go back, his desire to go back and see, right? I want to go back and experience what these old, you know, these older times were really like. But at the same time, are we still autobiographical? Yeah, and possibly just as much autobiographical. Is this Tolkien articulating his own primordial desire? You know, the thing which informed his own career as a scholar, his own studies in philology and mythology, not so much archaeology. Though he sort of acknowledged the importance of it, right? But he never studied it himself. Yeah, I mean, the desire that Alboin articulates of wanting to go back and wishing he could just go back and see, right? To hear them speak their own language, to see their culture with his own eyes, to hear their stories with his own ears. That's what he wants, right? That's what he wishes for. And did Tolkien wish for that? Yeah, definitely he did. And I think we can see this, especially in Tolkien's early poetry. We're going to get to some poetry next week. Yeah, I love when I did the Tolkien's poetry class in the Signum Tolkien studies program, which was an awesome class, one of my most favoritist classes I've ever done. But when I did that, I did a bunch of the poems from this book, From the Lost Road, in that class. And so I'm excited to get to them sort of organically as we go through here. We'll talk about those next time. Anyway, okay. So once again, we see the autobiographical and the fantasy marching still kind of side by side here, right? Then we have this poem that came through. He's not just getting languages anymore, right? We do get here now we get a shift where instead of just speaking as if his language creation process was one of language discovery rather than language invention, right? He's gone beyond that. Now the dreams in which these words came through to him from wherever it was they were coming from are now sending him other things, right? Other things are coming through, including snippets of things in languages he already knows, like Anglo-Saxon, right? And that's a different kind of thing, right? Why is he getting Anglo-Saxon verses in his sleep, right? He can think of some naturalistic explanation for that, right? Hardly surprising that somebody like him would dream of Anglo-Saxon verses, and yet it feels like something coming through again. And so when that starts happening, it ceases to sound like a question of him sort of, I don't know what, eavesdropping on a different world, right? Hearing snatches of their language and putting it together. Now it sounds like something's actually communicating with him, right? Someone's trying to tell him something. And I started here with the modern English translation that Tolkien gives of the Anglo-Saxon verses. Thus said Ælfwine the far-travelled, there is many a thing in the west regions unknown to men, marvels and strange beings, a land fair and lovely, the homeland of the elves, and the bliss of the gods. Little doth any man know what longing is his, whom old age cutteth off from return. He suddenly regretted translating the last two lines. Remember, this is when his dad is really old. His father looked up with an odd expression. The old know, he said, but age does not cut us off from going away, from Eftsith. That's the going away, right? There is no Eftsith. We can't go back. So you've got Eftsith and Eftsith, right? Going away and coming back. There is no Eftsith. You can't come back. You need not tell me that. But good for Ælfwine Albion. You could always do verses. Damn it, as if he would make up stuff like that, just to tell it to the old man, practically on his deathbed. His father had, in fact, died during the following winter. Alboin is very frustrated, right? Because his father doesn't get it. His father still thinks he's making all this stuff up, right? That the way that when he talks about words coming through and all that stuff, that's merely a kind of a poetic fiction, right? His own sort of whimsical way of explaining or talking about his own invention process. And so here he was trying to tell his father the next level, right? Yeah, stuff keeps coming through, but I think there's somebody trying to deliver me a message. Here's what the message was. And his father just thinks he made up this poem, right? And is trying, presumably, to send his father a message through telling him this poem that he made up, right? The smile of his father at the reference to the name Ælfwine, right, is of course in reference to the earlier conversation where the father tells Alboin that his name means Ælfwine, right? His name would have been Ælfwine in Anglo-Saxon, elf friend. That's the meaning of his name. So the fact that the verses that he made up are a quotation from Ælfwine, which is what Alboin's name means itself, I mean, there's every reason to make the error that Oswin has made, right? It's a perfectly plausible error. It sounds like the message that Alboin has himself made up. And instead, what Alboin is attempting to communicate is, I received this message, and it kind of sounds like it's from me, right? But it's not from me, and I don't get this. But look at what it says. There is many a thing in the west regions unknown to men, marvels and strange beings, a land fair and lovely, the homeland of the elves, and the bliss of the gods. What is that? What do those lines give us? Those lines give us a later description of Valinor, a memory of the undying lands in the west, of Elvenhome and Valinor in the west, from the perspective of a country whose active, of a culture whose active legends no longer include any stories about it directly, right? We're not in the world of Numenor anymore. We don't retain the memory of, the struggle between the Noldor and Morgoth and all that stuff. We don't know them anymore. We don't even know their names anymore. It's just but the rumors of that strange land in the west. The fairness and loveliness of the land, the fact that it's the homeland of the elves and that the bliss of the gods dwells there, that concept lingers and remains in whatever time Ælfwine, who is being quoted and whose quotation is coming through to Alboin in his dream, whenever that was, they still retain this image. And so then what do we get after that? Little doth any man know what longing is his, whom old age cutteth off from return. Little doth any man know what longing is his, whom old age cutteth off from return. Return to where? And longing for what? In the context of that first sentence about Valinor and the undying lands in the west, right, we might come into the assumption, so coming from that first sentence through, little doth any man know what longing is his, I'm ready for, finish this sentence, right? In the context of the fall of Numenor and all this stuff, I'm thinking, little doth any man know what longing is his, who who looks out at the sea, right? Maybe it's a sea longing. Maybe it's who gazes down the straight path but can't walk on it, right? Or something like that. I mean, we're talking about the longing for the West? Clear, obviously, right? Context of that first sentence. Obviously, we're talking about the longing for the West, right? Right? Except, whom old age cutteth off from return? It's like, whoa, I didn't see old age coming. Wait, we're talking about death? Like mortality? That's what we're talking about? I mean, I assume that's the old age cutting people off. We're talking about mortality and old age and death, right? Okay, so the longing, little doth any man know what longing is his when you get old and are about to die. Okay. Well, that's obviously still got some Numenorean relevance, though it doesn't seem to be exactly where we were headed in that first sentence, right? But okay. But what is old age doing? Right? Mortality, again, presumably, is what old age is doing. Cutteth off from return? To what? To your people? Like, I mean, you go away and you don't come back, right? Sure. From return to the West, the Undying Lands, the homeland of the Elves, to something else, unknown. And I think the answer, cutteth off from return to what? Return to Numenor, right? That the beginning of this quotation recalls the connection with the elves, right? Recalls the West and the Undying Lands and the last lingering memory of that myth. But then the end of the quotation seems to point to Numenor itself. And of course, I say that mostly because that's the trend of most of the stuff that is coming through to Alboin in these first two chapters, right? He keeps getting all this Numenorean stuff. And it makes sense of that last sentence, right? It's not just the longing for life when death is approaching. It's not just clinging to Middle-earth. It's that old age is cutting you off from return. Mortality is cutting you off from return to something. To the past, maybe. To his youth, possibly. But yeah, I think Numenor is kind of lingering here. The message that he's getting, right? So we get, this is like now he's getting like Quenya telegrams, right, from wherever these things are coming from, right? Ar Sauron Tule. So okay, I'll just read the English here because we're running out of time. And Sauron, can't translate that word, right? And Sauron came Nahamna. They fell Turkildi under shadow. Tarkalion, war made on powers. Lord of West, world broke. Of Iluvatar, seas poured in chasm. Numenor downfell. Road straight went westward. All now roads bent Turkildi eastward. Death shadow us is heavy, far away, now Atalanta. And he doesn't get Atalanta. He's probably sharp enough to notice the similarity between Atalanta and Ataltane here, right? But what he also perceives is that Atalante seems to be a name that he doesn't know, right? Okay. What do we see here? If he's getting messages, right? If he's not just eavesdropping on random conversation and picking up linguistic nuggets from the other side, if instead the other side is actively communicating with him, I keep calling it the other side. We don't know side of what, right? In the end, of course, well, I say in the end as if Lost Road had an end. Later in chapter 2, we'll discover that it's time, right? He wishes he could return back to the past and listen to people speaking in their own language. In his dreams, he is, because the people from the past are speaking to him in his dreams, right? But my question is, what are they telling him, right? Yeah, good. Sharon points out that the quip begins with a classic Tolkien rhetoric sentence, right? And Sauron came, right? Yeah, there you go. There you go. That line is in the Silmarillion, right? Absolutely. But anyway, what's the message? What's the message? Yeah, Morgoth comes too, Murray. That's a different line. There's both lines are there, and Morgoth came when Fingolfin beats on the door. And Sauron came when Ar-Pharazôn comes to challenge him. But what happens? What's the message? It's the story of Numenor. We could put this next to the outline of the fall of Numenor, and we could actually do here the same thing that I did back then, right? What are the fundamental, what are the stories? Is this just like a fragment of narrative? Is the past reaching forward to Alboin and giving him exposition, right? Not exactly, right? But it's what does it emphasize? What does it tell us? Sauron came, they fell under shadow, they made war on the powers. The Lord of the West broke the world. The seas of Iluvatar poured in the chasm, Numenor fell. Numenor downfell, right? Notice how that differs from the story of the fall of Numenor. Even just thinking about the passages that we were just looking at tonight for the first time, right? We don't get and they invited Sauron, which was stupid, and brought the whole thing on themselves, right? Sauron came, they fell under shadow. They made war on the power. So they're still... Tarkalion, of course, he doesn't know that word either, but it's the name of the king, right? Tarkalion made war on the powers. He's still doing something, right? I mean, he's the one who's making war. But they fell under shadow because Sauron came. So we get the tragedy of Numenor, right? Sauron came, fell under shadow, war made on powers, and then the consequences. The Lord of the West broke the world. The seas poured into the chasm, Numenor fell. But wait, there's more. It's not just the tragedy of Numenor. That's half the story. The other half of the story is the part that he keeps getting. Notice he keeps getting both halves, right? It's the eagles of the Lords of the West come upon Numenor. This is the thing that he keeps finding himself, so this keeps springing out of him, right? And it springs out of Elendil too in chapter 4, right? So, yeah, the perception of the tragedy, right? That's one thing. But that's not the whole story. The other half of the story is about the straight road, right? The other thing that keeps springing, that keeps coming through to Alboin is this business about the straight road, right? That the world was bent, but a straight road remains. Road straight went westward, all now roads bent. Death's shadow us is heavy, far away now, Atalanta. Atalanta, the downfallen, Numenor, is now far away. The death shadow us is heavy. By the way, I love the translation. I love how he encapsulates the concepts that a single word means. Like, he could have translated Octakare as made war, right? Why didn't he just say made war? Under shadow, Tarkalion made war on the powers. He could have just, I mean, that's how you would translate it. If you were translating into English, you'd say Tarkalion made war on the powers. How hard is that, right? There, it's right there. But that's not how he gives it to us, right? Instead, he shows us how that word means war made. And on powers is a different concept. Again, it's because it's an inflected language. but I love the way that he conveys that. That we get this sense of like us is heavy, right? Death shadow, us is heavy. It's not just the shadow of death. The shadow of death is a phrase, but it's not the phrase, the shadow of death. It's Nuruhuine. And of course, if we are looking at Nuruhuine, we should be remembering Unuhuine, under shadow. They fell under shadow. And since they fell under shadow, and then the Numenor fell down, or it downfell, excuse me, now death shadow, us is heavy. Really cool stuff. Kelly Gottschalk is asking, are these words given to him? Are they giving him to him the myth that he was looking for? Yeah, Kelly, that's exactly what we got. That thing that he said he wanted, right? To hear with his own ears their languages, to get, not just to have bones, right? But to get the meat, to get the mythology and the legends. He's getting it, right? And the two myths that he's getting are A, the tragic fall of Numenor as it fell under the shadow and then downfell beneath the sea, but the existence of the straight road. It's lost, right? All roads are now bent, but the road still goes straight westward. The death shadow is heavy on us. Numenor, Atalante, the downfall is far away, but that straight road is still there, right? And still exists. So, Kelly, the really cool thing that we get in this time travel story, the time travel hasn't happened yet, right? I mean, our protagonist, Alboin, is still in the modern day. And yet, the time travel is already happening, right? He says, I wish I could travel in time so that I could encounter these cultures, directly. And he is encountering these cultures directly because they're coming to him, right? Time travel is already happening. So when he's going to go on his journey, he finds that he already, he already is on his journey. His journey has already begun, which is how a good time travel story should work, because it's a time thing. Anyway, but of course it's not just him, right? He shares this stuff with his son, Auduin. He tramped on. This is Auduin, of course. Dreams, he thought, but not the usual sort, quite different, very vivid, and though never quite repeated, all gradually fitting into a story. But a sort of phantom story with no explanations. Just pictures, not a sound, not a word. Ships coming to land, towers on the shore, battles with swords glinting but silent. And there is that ominous picture, the great temple on the mountains smoking like a volcano. And that awful vision of the chasm in the seas, a whole land slipping sideways, mountains rolling over, dark ships fleeing into the dark. I want to tell someone about it and get some kind of sense into it. Father would help. We could make up a good yarn together out of it. If I knew even the name of the place, it would turn a nightmare into a story. Of course, you see what's happening, right? Alboin is being given the bones, and Auduin is being given the flesh, right? Alboin will be the ears, and Auduin will be the eyes, we are told. But of course, to this point in the story, they've never spoken, right? Neither of them knows that they both have dreams. Auduin is kind of hoping he could possibly maybe tell his dad about his dreams so they could make up a story about it, right? Alboin had just been thinking about the dreams, and now this choice that's been put before him, whether he wants to travel in time and take his son with him, but he has to choose, right? And he chickens out, talking to Auduin about it right before Auduin goes out on this trip. And then, of course, we learn, or this tramp, rather, and then, of course, we learn that Auduin, far from being sympathetic on the subject of dreams, is having them himself and wishing he had somebody to talk to about them. So that connection between them, and yet the distance, is clearly a crucial element. So how does this time travel work? What is up with this time travel? Let's look at that a little bit. We'll probably finish after this. Yeah, I think we'll finish after this. We'll save the Numenorean stuff for next time. We'll pick up there. All right. How does the time travel stuff work? Well, the first clue we get here is his own connections. This is his father explaining to him. Well, I might have called you Alfwine, of course. That is the Old English form of it. I might have called you that, not only after Alfwine of Italy, but after all the elf friends of old. After Alfwine, King Alfred's grandson, who fell in the great victory of 937, and Alfwine, who fell in the famous defeat at Malden, and many other Englishmen and Northerners in the long line of elf friends. But I gave you a Latinized form. I think that is best. The old days of the North are gone beyond recall, except insofar as they have been worked into the shape of things as we know it, into Christendom. So I took Alboin, for it is not Latin and not Northern, and that is the way of most names in the West, and also of the men that bear them. Notice what we're getting from this, right? I took your name from a long line of elf friends, right? There are all these elf friends in different traditions, right? There's the Old English form, there's the Latinized form, but the elf friends have continued in this long line, right? And they influence the present, right? They've been worked into the shape of things as we know it, right? The names in the West and the men that bear those names are not Latin and not Northern, right? But sort of the inheritors of both of those traditions. So the seeds that are being planted here in this passage in the story is this sense of continuity, right? There's Alboin, our protagonist, and his connection to the Lombardic Alboin, after whom he was named. And then there's Alfwine and the series of Alfwine and elf friends stretching forward and backwards over time. And so we're being invited to see Alboin as a part of that continuum, right? This tradition of elf friends, which are in some way connected to each other. Okay. The real thing was the feeling the dreams brought more and more insistently, and taking force from an alliance with the ordinary professional occupations of his mind. Surveying the last 30 years, he felt he could say that his most permanent mood, though often overlaid or suppressed, had been since childhood the desire to go back. To walk in time, perhaps, as men walk on long roads, or to survey it, as men may see the world from a mountain, or the earth as a living map beneath an airship. But in any case, to see with eyes and to hear with ears, to see the lie of the old and even forgotten lands, to behold ancient men walking and hear their languages as they spoke them in the days before the days, when tongues of forgotten lineage were heard in kingdoms long fallen by the shores of the Atlantic. See how different his idea of the past is from his father's idea of the super crude people with the super crude language and the super crude culture, right? Back in the Ice Ages. His concept of it is really very different. But this desire to go, the core of Alboin's story is a longing for the past, right? Longing to hear these things. And of course, as we've already been seeing, he's already hearing them. That's what the dreams have been doing. So the dreams have been instilling this longing in him, but they've also been kind of satisfying it in a sense. And then he gets an offer. A tall figure appeared, as if descending an unseen stair towards him. For a moment it flashed through his thought that the face, dimly seen, reminded him of his father. I am with you. I was of Numenor, the father of many fathers before you. I am Elendil, that is in Erissaean elf friend, and many have been called so since. You may have your desire. What desire? The long hidden and the half spoken, to go back. Eftsith, I am telling you, you can have that longing to go back, that longing which nobody can describe, that longing for Eftsith, which is denied to mortals. You can have you can go back. But that cannot be, even if I wish it. It's against the law. It is against the rule. Laws are commands upon the will and are binding. Rules are conditions. They may have exceptions. Love that distinction between law and rule. Law is a command upon the will and is binding. No exception to the law. Rules have exceptions. They're merely conditions under which things operate. Okay. So what do we learn? He meets and encounters Elendil, right? Elendil comes and speaks to him. So here's his desire already fulfilled, right? You may have your desire. He could also just as well say, you are having your desire, right? Hey, I'm Elendil of Numenor here, right? Here to speak to you in my language and what you see my culture and everything. So you are having your desire. I'm gonna let you go back in time, but of course notice also what he emphasizes. He picks up on the Alboin thing, right, that we were looking at before. That concept which was merely implied in that passage about Alboin's name. This, well, at least a tradition of people named Elfriend, right, in different cultures and stretching forward over time. And here's Elendil saying, hey, my name's Elfriend. Your name's Elfriend. My name is Elfriend, right? Except my name is Elfriend in Erasean, and I'm from Numenor. Oh, and I'm your ancestor, right? I was of Numenor, the father of many fathers before you. I believe that means you're my descendant, right? I am your ancestor. So there's an actual family connection between them. I ask you if you would have your desire. I would. You ask not how or upon what conditions. I do not suppose I should understand how, and it does not seem to me necessary. We go forward as a rule, but we do not know how. But what are the conditions? That the road and the halts are prescribed, that you cannot return at your wish, but only, if at all, as it may be ordained. For you shall not be as one reading a book or looking in a mirror, but as one walking in living peril. Moreover, you shall not adventure yourself alone. Okay. This bit gives us more than anything else that we get in The Lost Road. More than anything else, this passage gives us a glimpse of what the plan was, right? Remember, of course, all this started because Tolkien lost the coin toss, right? Instead of doing, he's not going to do a space travel story, he's going to do a time travel story. So he's been assigned to write a story about time travel. And obviously, first question, right? Okay, you're going to write a story about time travel. How are you going to do it? Going to make a time machine, right? Tolkien, as we see, rejects the time machine. They talk about a time machine. I love, it's Elendil here in this conversation who says to him, no machine can conquer time, right? Not how it works. Okay, so if you're not going to have a time machine, then what? What's your mechanism? How are you going to travel in time? His answer? Not even going to talk about it, right? I don't suppose I should understand it, and it doesn't seem to me necessary to understand it, Alboin says, right? Not curious about the mechanism, I just want to go. I love Alboin's addition there, though. We go forward as a rule, but we don't know how, right? We all travel in time constantly, right? We travel into the future 1 minute at a time. I don't understand the mechanism for that. How is it that human beings all travel forward at the approximate pace of 24 hours a day, right? We're all traveling through time. How are we doing it? By what mechanism do we travel through time? I don't know. If I don't know that, why would I think that I should be able to explain? So it's, you can call it a dodge, but I don't think it's a dodge. I think that because I don't think he's going to entirely dodge it. I don't think, rather, he plans to entirely dodge the mechanism. Instead, he's pointing out that it's not going to be just a crude mechanical thing. It's not just going to be a machine. You build and you step into the machine, you step out of the machine, and there you are in a different time, right? It's going to take a wholly different approach. And it's going to be like the way that normal time travel happens, right? Daily time travel. Again, the implication here, this is not the conquest of man over nature. right? This is, again, not human beings have devised a way to break the rules, right? Or even to break the laws. No. The law, it's from the laws, it's from the rules themselves that the mystery comes, right? He doesn't understand the rules, so why should he understand the exception to the rule? He's told that there could be an exception to the rule. Traveling forward in time at a regular pace is the rule. Traveling backward is an exception to that rule. But both of them, both the rule and the exception within this story, operate on the same basis, right? On the same plane, as it were. But there are conditions. He is interested in what are the conditions. Not the mechanism, but the conditions. The road and the halts are described. Halts. So, okay, he's going to go to more than one time, right? He's going to make multiple stops in his trip through time. Clearly. That's one thing we learn there. The other thing we learn, he's not in control. Again, this is not the conquest of man over nature. He's not driving the TARDIS, right? He is following a path that has been prescribed for him. He can't return at his wish, but only as it may be ordained. How he goes is not up to him. Whether he comes back is not up to him. Why? Because he's going to be walking in living peril. This isn't something he's just going to see. Two of you, Thomas Kaluza and Margaret Joyce, are both thinking about Christmas Carol. And there's clearly a similarity there, right? In Dream, there's the traveling, in Dream traveling back in time to see, and being brought there by a power which is above and beyond him. It's not by his own power that Ebenezer Scrooge goes back in time, right? But the main difference I would emphasize, Margaret and Thomas, the thing I think is so important about the conditions that are being described there, is the difference is it's not like looking in a mirror. With Scrooge, it kind of is, right? In a Christmas Carol, he is himself. When he goes back into the past, when he goes, forward into the future, he is himself not visible, right? He can't interact with anything. He can only see it, right? He is merely a sort of a spirit and observer. That is not how Alboin's time travel is going to be. Well, no, James, it's not an out-of-body experience. It's an in-body experience. That's the thing, right? He's going to be walking in living peril. When he goes back into the past, he's not going to be an eyewitness to the past. He's going to be a participant in the past. That's how the time travel is going to work. So when he travels, like when he wakes up or however it happens, he is going to wake up as somebody from the past. He's going to be personally involved. Is his own body going to travel? Is he going to be in other people's bodies? We don't know. We don't know. Yes, Carrie, I was thinking the same thing. Books are safe. Mirrors are safe. The road is not safe. Absolutely. Excellent. Super kudos for the Neverending Story reference. Very good. Very good. Yeah, good, James, exactly. Scrooge was having an out-of-body experience. Good, yeah. Alboin is distinctly not going to be having. He's going to be having an in-body experience. Is it his own body? Is it going to be somebody else's body? We don't really know. But P.S., bring your son, or rather, your son is going to be coming too. This is a duo adventure, not a solo adventure. Okay, let's stop there. I have a little bit of time, not that much time, but we started really late. I want to let you guys get to bed. Thank you for your patience staying up with me extra time since we started so late. But I want to make a clean stop here. Next time we'll pick up with chapters 3 and 4. So we'll look at the Numenorean chapters, and then we're going to be looking at the unwritten, Christopher's discussion of the unwritten chapters for next time. And of course, the poems. don't skip the poems. Read the poems because we're talking about those. Do I make myself clear? Thanks, everybody. So I will see you guys next week. I'll be back at home next week and hopefully back on the normal schedule. So in other words, only 5 to 10 minutes late rather than 45 minutes late. Thanks, everybody. Good night now. Bye.